The talk is called The Epistemic Innocence of Psychedelic States. There's a specific kind of metaphysical worldview that classic psychedelics tend to promote, and it's a view according to which space, time, and individual selfhood are all basically illusory, and the entire manifest world is grounded in a transcendent universal consciousness. So it's a kind of worldview that Aldous Huxley called the perennial philosophy, and Alan Watts called a joyous cosmology. Now, I have a good friend who's also a philosopher and a psychedelic enthusiast, and he and I have spent many hours blowing our minds discussing this kind of metaphysical picture. And so again and again, I find myself saying to him in awestruck tones, "But what if it's true? What if it's true?" I've said this more than once at 3 or 4 a.m., okay? But on the other hand, right, what if it's not? That's the question I'm going to be addressing in this talk. So it's at least possible that the joyous cosmology is just a drug-induced illusion, or what the philosopher Owen Flanagan calls a metaphysical hallucination. And if it is, there are difficult questions about how to regard the transformative use of psychedelics. So Michael Pollan puts one such question forcefully in an article about the use of psychedelic therapy in end-of-life care. And he says, "Is psychedelic therapy simply foisting a comforting delusion on the sick and dying?" Well, my thesis in a nutshell is that even if psychedelic therapy is foisting a comforting delusion on the sick and dying, it is not simply doing so. So the answer to Pollan's question is no. So even if the mystical experience is not veridical, it's not all bad news for the epistemic status of psychedelic therapy. By the way, that's my one sort of major piece of jargon for today. The word epistemic just means of or pertaining to knowledge. Okay, so relating to knowledge. So I'm going to argue that even on the assumption that psychedelic therapy has significant epistemic flaws, it also has significant and unique epistemic benefits. And to frame this argument, I'm going to use a concept recently introduced in epistemology, the philosophical study of knowledge, and this is Lisa Bortolotti's concept of epistemic innocence. So, there are 4 steps. First, I'll briefly review the facts about psychedelics from which the problem arises. Second, I'll introduce the concept of epistemic innocence. Third, I'll argue that the concept applies appropriately to psychedelic therapy. And fourth, I'm going to conclude with some reflections on why it matters. In short, it matters because truth and knowledge do. So the fact that psychedelics benefit people emotionally is surely important, and maybe in the final analysis it's what's most important. But I'm going to suggest that epistemic issues need to be taken into account in policy discussions. They can't just be dismissed or ignored as insignificant. So, we start with the transformative potential of psychedelics, and as I'm sure everyone in this room knows, there's been a recent renaissance of human psychedelic research. A number of small studies suggest that classic serotonin 2A agonist psychedelics like LSD and psilocybin can cause durable psychological benefits with 1 or 2 administrations. Small studies in healthy volunteers That's not right. Small studies in patients have shown lasting reductions in symptoms of depression, anxiety, and addiction, and small studies in healthy volunteers have found lasting increases in positive personality dimensions such as openness to experience. So it seems that classic psychedelics can rapidly occasion lasting psychological benefits. Now, it's not yet known exactly how psychedelics do this, but a key part of the mechanism seems to be the induction of transformative mystical experiences. These are the experiences I mentioned earlier, these apparently direct apprehensions of a joyous cosmology. So Houston Smith said that the basic message of psychedelics is that there is another reality, capital R, that puts this one in the shade. Typically, this reality is described as being pure consciousness from which the multifarious varieties of manifestation emerge. And it seems such experiences are a big part of how psychedelics cause psychological benefits. So in several studies, the degree of mystical experience predicts the degree of transformative effects. Now, this all becomes problematic when viewed from the perspective of philosophical naturalism. Naturalism is a hugely ambiguous term in contemporary philosophy, but for our purposes we can treat it as the view that the universe is thoroughly material, and consciousness is a recent evolutionary development. So on this view, consciousness, like life, is something that emerges from complex organisation rather than being built in from the start. Now, I'm not going to argue for this view today. I'm just going to note that it's orthodoxy in current philosophy of mind and neuroscience and ask, what do we see if we look at psychedelic therapy through this lens? And the first thing we see is that the mystical experience has to be a metaphysical hallucination. So the mystic sees consciousness as fundamental to reality, which is just what naturalism denies. So this is where Pollan's question comes in. Is this form of therapy all about inducing comforting delusions? So to start arguing for my negative answer, I'm going to turn to some recent philosophical work on, funnily enough, delusions. So the philosopher Lisa Bortolotti has been leading a movement to re-evaluate the epistemic status of what she calls imperfect cognitions. So things like delusion, confabulation, implicit bias, and so on. Now, it's a familiar idea that states like this can have a mixed pragmatic or practical profile, okay? So they can have psychological or emotional benefits as well as costs. So just take, for example, what have been called motivated delusions, such as anosognosia, which is a denial of illness, and reverse Othello syndrome, which is a conviction that one's romantic partner is faithful despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. This is a real clinical condition, by the way. These delusions definitely cause distress, right? But it's been argued that they can serve a defensive psychological function of concealing a truth so terrible that its acknowledgement would cause despair and psychological collapse. So it's appealing to think that in cases like this, pragmatic benefits are just purchased with epistemic costs. Basically, ignorance is bliss. But Bortolotti says we should resist this idea. It's too simplistic, okay? The reality is more complicated. The epistemic profiles of such conditions can be as complex and mixed as their pragmatic profiles. Just as they can have significant emotional benefits as well as costs, she suggests that they can have significant epistemic benefits as well as costs. So what we get then is the idea of an epistemically imperfect cognition that nonetheless has real epistemic benefits. And to articulate this idea, Bortolotti coins the concept of epistemic innocence. And she gives this definition of it. There are two conditions. An imperfect cognition is epistemically innocent if, number one, the cognition confers a significant epistemic benefit to the agent at the time of its adoption. Number two, alternative cognitions that would lead to those benefits are unavailable to the agent at that time. And so her argument in relation to motivated delusions is if they really can prevent psychological collapse, then at the same time they cause epistemic benefit. How so? Well, because catastrophically miserable people don't tend to engage as much with the world or other people. And for humans, these are key ways of gaining knowledge. So by preserving psychological function, key epistemic functions are preserved too. And there are no alternatives because by assumption, more accurate cognitions would fail to prevent psychological collapse and so fail to preserve epistemic functioning. Okay, so that's the concept of epistemic innocence fleshed out with an example. What about psychedelic therapy? Well, with regard to the first condition, significant epistemic benefit, when psychedelic therapy works, it will bring this about in the same way as Bortolotti's delusions, indirectly via emotional benefits. People who are less anxious, depressed, or addicted, or more open to experience, are likely to engage more with the world and with other people, and gain all kinds of knowledge in the process. Also, there's some evidence that psychedelics help to restore cognitive flexibility, and it's possible, I think, to interpret that as a restoration of the ability to gain knowledge of possibilities, okay? So greater cognitive flexibility, greater ability to gain knowledge about what's possible. And this is the kind of thing that philosophers call modal knowledge, okay? Knowledge about possibility and necessity and so on. So as well as those indirect benefits, I think that subjects can also gain significant epistemic benefits directly from the psychedelic experience itself. I've given these arguments in more detail elsewhere, so I can expand on this in question time if anyone wants. But there are two main types I'm going to mention. The first is that subjects become directly acquainted with previously latent potentials of their own minds. And this is the kind of thing that philosophers call knowledge by acquaintance, as opposed to second-hand theoretical knowledge, descriptive knowledge, knowledge by testimony, okay? You know about something by coming into direct contact with it. Likewise, I think that subjects plausibly gain knowledge by acquaintance of the contingent and constructed nature of their sense of self or ego identity. And I want to suggest that these are both serious and significant discoveries to make. So the second condition for epistemic innocence was that no alternative cognitions are available at the time that will provide the same epistemic benefits. Well, with the indirect benefits of psychedelic therapy, the ones that sort of result from emotional benefits, this seems very plausible. So part of what's so exciting about psychedelics in psychiatry is that they promise to be uniquely rapid and effective for treatment-resistant conditions. There just is no known viable alternative at the time for most patients. So that's relevant to the indirect benefits. With the direct benefits, knowledge by acquaintance of the mind's potential and of the contingency of the sense of self, one thought might be that meditation practice is an alternative route to those kinds of knowledge. Fair enough, I think it is, but even if it's available at the time, its results are not, okay? They typically take a lot longer than with psychedelics. So the definition of epistemic innocence is ambiguous as to which sense of at a time is important, right? Is it whether the alternative cognition is available at the time, or is it whether its results are? But I think we can see, based on the practicalities of cases like this, that it's clearly availability of the results at a time that's important. So I'm going to conclude that in the relevant sense, there are no alternative routes to those epistemic benefits available to subjects. So just to summarize what I've said so far, given philosophical naturalism, psychedelic therapy definitely has significant epistemic faults, or at least epistemic risks. As such, it can be seen as an imperfect cognition, but it also offers access to significant direct and indirect epistemic benefits, alternative routes to which are not in the relevant sense available to the agent at that time. So all of this amounts to saying that psychedelic states in such cases are epistemically innocent, according to the definition that Lisa Bortolotti gives. So finally, why does it matter? Well, as I said at the start, it matters because truth and knowledge matter. So one possible approach to all of this, which the philosopher Owen Flanagan takes very roughly, is to say, well, who cares as long as it helps people get better, right? That's what really matters. But there are a couple of famous philosophical ideas that I think sort of push against that. So Robert Nozick talks about the experience machine, which is basically a VR system that if you plug into it will give you immeasurably sort of pleasant and varied experiences for the rest of your life, and you'll be none the wiser, okay? So it's a bit like the Matrix, if the Matrix were programmed to give you the most enjoyable life possible. But none of it's going to be real, of course. All the people, all the experiences will be simulated. And the thought experiment is, given the choice, would you plug into the experience machine for the rest of your life, right? And lots of us would hesitate to plug in because we want our experiences to be grounded in reality, right? There's something about truth and knowledge itself that matters to us above and beyond whether our experiences are pleasurable or enjoyable. Also consider Pascal's wager, right, which most of you are probably familiar with. So many people think that there's something ethically dubious about trying to believe in God just because it'll be good for you. So you can think about a terminally ill, hardcore atheist being offered psychedelic therapy for their anxiety and depression. They might have similar concerns, okay? They might think about Pascal's wager and think, well, maybe I'm just signing up to acquire a comforting delusion. They might have sort of ethical qualms about actually undergoing this process. And so my analysis is aimed, in large part at dispelling those kinds of concerns. Psychedelic therapy is a reasonable option for these people, not just because it does the job, but also because it's epistemically more respectable than the experience machine and Pascal's wager, for the sorts of reasons I've been discussing. And I think that this sort of overall epistemic evaluation should figure in policy discussions about psychedelic therapy, okay? It's not enough to just set epistemic issues to one side and say, who cares as long as it works, right? So I'm not going to say all of this. I've said most of this already. Most broadly, I think the conclusion here, or the significance, is that the epistemic status of non-ordinary or imperfect cognitions deserves careful and rigorous re-examination. And I don't know if I'm early, but that's all I have to say. So